What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be my long, I guess, awaited overdue to answer your comments from my latest music question video, which is from me to you guys of which albums do you consider to be your underrated favorites. Now, bear in mind, there will be some that I have not got a clue what to say because, number one, I have not heard of the album, or number two, I haven't heard of the band as well. So there will be some answers that I'm going to skip, and I apologize for that. But, however, there are a lot of these albums that I do know, and I will do my best to answer them. So, without any further ado, let's dive in. The first couple of comments are from Ryan Rupre. The answers to him are The Nephilim by Fields of the Nephilim, Bloody Kisses by Typo Negative, Nowhere by Ride, Born Too Late by Saint Vitus, and Inagada Davida. I don't think Bloody Kisses is underrated whatsoever because most Typo Negative fans see that album as more of their favorite or top favorite albums. So I wouldn't see that album in particular as underrated because it has been known actually as one of the greatest albums in that particular genre. As with Ride on their album Nowhere, again, to me that's not underrated. I think Going Blank Again is pretty underrated, and at the moment it's my favorite album from the band. But Nowhere has been one of those must-hear essential albums in the shoegaze genre, and I think that this is a really strong, near-perfect album. For Saint Vitus, Born Too Late, I don't personally know a lot of the Saint Vitus discography enough to personally address anything, but I may have heard a song or two from the band. But in terms of an album as a whole, I actually haven't checked it out yet. Inagada Davida by Iron Butterfly, that album is also a pretty iconic one in the late 60s because of its very rocking, pretty psychedelic, trippy musical presence. And when it comes to the late 60s being one of my personal favorite eras of the music as a whole, this album is personally pretty iconic, and I actually really quite liked the overall sound of what the band decided to create, as the psychedelic movement was really dominating around that time, just like with the obvious ones of Disraeli Gears to Sgt. Pepper and Pet Sounds. The next comment is from Ethan Work. Voivod's The Outer Limits. I just listened to it last night and it has now cemented itself as one of my favorite albums ever. The fact that it isn't listed among the band's best is a travesty. Some other Voivod fans would say previous or later albums, like with Killing Technology, as one of the band's best. But The Outer Limits, I feel that the album does have a lot of really good enjoyability to, in my opinion, some very, very good stuff across what that album is like. And Voivod is actually a band that I would be interested highly to discover even more. And I actually bought their Synchro Anarchy album, their latest album last year. I don't find that The Outer Limits is one of those albums to be so underappreciated, because I personally would see this as still a really good album from the band. The next comment is from KJS Estate 1994. My favorite underrated album is Calling All Stations by Genesis, the final album released by Genesis and the only album to feature vocalist Ray Wilson on vocals. The album was heavily slaughtered by both Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins era fans, when it first came out due to Wilson not being from a well-known background, even though he sounded so much like Gabriel in the album. The many songs that I love in Calling All Stations are Congo, Shipwrecked, Not About Us, and The Dividing Line. However, I didn't like Small Talk that much since it sounded way too much like Sledgehammer, despite fans saying that it was a dour album to finish Genesis' legacy on. Calling All Stations is an underrated album and definitely worth a listen to. I think Calling All Stations, in my personal opinion, has some moments, but I won't go into that album in many details yet because I have yet to do the continuation of reviewing the band's discography. But I understand the argument that some Genesis fans would see Calling All Stations as maybe the worst Genesis record besides the album previously, that is We Can't Dance. But I don't know, I think Ray Wilson is not that bad of a vocalist. I personally don't agree that he sounds like Gabriel. I'll add one bit into this video here. Yet, as I said, I need to review the rest of the band's discography. Shipwrecked, though, in my eyes, is one of the absolute worst Genesis songs. The album was made for what it was. With Ray Wilson, he did his absolute best. The next comment is from Midnight Social, and he has selected a few. Slayer, Divine Intervention, Pantera, The Great Southern Trendkill, Darkness, Permission to Land, Arctic Monkeys, Tranquility Base, Hotel and Casino, and 100 Reasons, Ideas Above Your Station. Divine Intervention from Slayer is, in my opinion, the last strong Slayer record, although Christ Illusion to me was another really good album that came out in the mid-2000s. Some Slayer fans have kind of overlooked Divine Intervention, personally because it doesn't have Dave Lombardo, or that some of the songs didn't strike out as a domination of the music that Slayer did from their powers, like with the earlier records. And you can't go wrong with the album cover, because I think that is probably one of my top 3 favourite Slayer album covers. The Great Southern Trendkill from Pantera, for me, it's one of those later albums that has a lot to be accepted as possibly the heaviest Pantera record, but I really like this album very, very much. And controversially, I think that this is a favourable listen than the Cowboys from Hell record, which is a really good one by itself. That album brought Pantera's identity into the massive amount of attention. The Great Southern Trendkill has a lot of really unapologetic, non-stop brutality, and some of the guitar solos are featured at some of Dimebag's absolute best, especially with the riffs. One of my most favourite Pantera songs ever is on this album, and this has given me some nostalgia at the same time when I was heavily into their sound in general. The Darkness album, Permission to Land, I'm not really a big fan of The Darkness, but I heavily appreciate their wit, their comedic humour, and the change of emotions on some of the tracks when it was at first all jolly and full of these quite sexualized contexts to then changing into something as emotional, but in like, again, the humorous way. But I think Permission to Land is a sound which has never been like one of my most favorites because of The Darkness as a band that I think are very talented, and you can't go wrong into their amazing, worthwhile musicianship. Arctic Monkeys, Tranquility Base, Hotel and Casino, a very ballsy choice, and it's something that has to be respected to this point. When the album first came out, people were slaying that album as not a great album, and some say that's like their worst record. I don't think a lot of fans from band favorites of people like Arctic Monkeys can accept the open-mindedness and change to whatever Arctic Monkeys wanted to do in their career for this point in their history. I mean, many classic rock bands have done this exact same thing. I mean, you've got Pink Floyd later on to Queen. While I think Arctic Monkeys is a really enjoyable and highly dedicated band, especially through this newer age into the modern rock scene, you know, you just have to accept the album the way it is, and change happens in a lot of ways, whether we can appreciate it or not. It's inevitable at the same time. However, with a creative freedom and a different source of a new sound, the Arctic Monkeys deserve a lot of the better respect for it. The next selection of albums comes from Chucky 8444, the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour, the Rolling Stones' Between the Buttons, Pink Floyd, A Saucer Full of Secrets, Queen, as I've just mentioned them like a minute or so ago, A Kind of Magic, Led Zeppelin 3, and Deep Purple, Who Do We Think We Are? The Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour, along with the same period for Sgt. Pepper's, yet alone the band had made a lot of these types of tracks around the same time when the Beatles were in the studio to follow up the Revolver record. Magical Mystery Tour is the most psychedelic Beatles record, obviously, but it is actually one of my most favourite Beatles records. I will say it's challenging for some fans at that time, especially through the nonsensical and really weird, childish and crazy lyrics like with I Am the Walrus. And there's still a lot of beautiful melodies from some of the other tracks like The Fool on the Hill and the heavily drony, affected Song of Blue Jay Way. All You Need Is Love is one of my most favourite Beatles songs of all time, and of course with Strawberry Fields Forever and the beautiful, highly joyful Penny Lane. Magical Mystery Tour as an album is, to me, one of the most creative bursts in their whole freedom ever since they had stopped touring, and I love the record. Between the Buttons is one of those other later Rolling Stones albums in the 60s, which some fans understandably personally don't like. I know that Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys loves that album. It doesn't matter which version it has to be when I listen to it, the UK version or the US version. But I think Between the Buttons is a really underrated classic record. Yeah, the production can be very muddy and, you know, so rough around the edges, but the quality into simplicity and something as diverse, just like what Aftermath was, the previous album before this, I find Between the Buttons to be a very strong collection. Understandably, and different opinions-wise, that Jagger and Richards eventually did hate the overall result of the record. Pink Floyd's A Saucer Full of Secrets, for some reason I just can't get into loving this album. I just don't find that album to be one of those best second albums, because with The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, that was a near-perfect classic in its own right. Saucer Full of Secrets, the final album with Syd Barrett, whilst Pink Floyd was working with him, and the first to have David Gilmour, it's not all of that a consistent and, dare I say it, a progressive record for me to enjoy it as highly. Corporal Clegg, for me, was a little bit childish and a bit silly and on the nose, But there are some highlights, like with Let There Be Light, to Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, to Jug Band Blues, to the instrumental title track. But it's not one of my favorite Pink Floyd records in like the highest of the rankings. And speaking of Pink Floyd, I have been really looking forward to do a re-ranking of the band's discography, and if you guys are up for it, then by all means address it in the comments, because Pink Floyd's one of my most favourite bands of all time in rock history, and with A Saucer Full of Secrets, to me it is an above average record. But I'm glad that it is one of your underrated favourites. Queen are kind of magic. This is when Queen had become very commercial and heavily been involved in the mainstream through the style in some pop to some disco flavors. Don't get me thinking about Hot Space. But A Kind of Magic, to me, is solid, although not as like a spectacular release, because for me, being somewhat of a big fan of Queen, the rock period of the band has always been my favourite in their jointed and heavily focused, connected mark of music. Production is so dated and heavily thin sounding in places, especially through the drums, to moments through the synthesizers, and with the mixing on the multi-tracked vocals. It has a lot of really solid, nice moments. Some of Freddie's vocals on the album were just as amazing and beautifully well sung, and the whole simplicity into their singles at this direction in the band are non-stop iconic. Besides that, it's not one of my most favourite Queen records. Led Zeppelin 3, on the other hand, to me is, I guess you would say, pretty underrated. It's one of those albums when Page, Plant and Company have decided to experiment through a lot of the folky elements to acoustic guitar engagements. And while they have done that through Led Zeppelin 4 to Houses of the Holy and Physical Graffiti, there's some awesome moments on this record. Obviously with the Immigrant Song, and Since I've Been Loving You, and Celebration Day, to name a few. Led Zeppelin 3 is, to me, a really good record, but in terms of, for me, ranking Led Zeppelin's discography, which maybe I could try out, I think Led Zeppelin 3 is not one of my top 5, but having said that, I understand the argument that some say that it is an underrated record, when some Zeppelin fans see it as one of their best. Deep Purple, Who Do We Think We Are? There's a lot of the talk about this record after following their biggest hit of an album called Machine Head. When some people think that it's one of their weakest, I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I remember the nostalgia as a kid of hearing Woman from Tokyo, and some of the later tracks on this period through this record. Yes, some of the lyrics are very questionable and not very good, like with some of the later stuff from Deep Purple, to try and follow up Machine Head, because how can they follow up material from early stuff, like with Highway Star to Child in Time, Black Knight, Speed King, Lazy, etc., and to find something to follow up those gems of tracks with material like this? I don't find the album to be all really bad either. There's a few below average to mediocre moments on this, but I don't know, I actually really enjoy this album quite a lot, despite a bit of the production and some of the tracks. Shizazzle, Robin Trower, Twice Removed from Yesterday, Megadeth, Euthanasia, Mastodon, Once More Round the Sun, ZZ Top, Tejas, Cemetery, An Evil Shade of Grey, Whiplash, Power and Pain, Metallica, Load/Reload, Iron Maiden, The X Factor, Amon Amarth, Jomsviking, and Judas Priest, Nostradamus. I will agree with Megadeth on Euthanasia because when I reviewed the album, I have loved almost all of it, and that's another band I need to catch up on and review all of their records. But I'll say this very briefly, that Euthanasia is, to me, one of my highest favourite Megadeth albums. And I love a lot of the tracks on this record, like Reckoning Day to Train of Consequences, A Tout Le Monde, and I think Victory is a really good, solid finale track. Family Tree as well. It's obviously nothing as a classic like with Rust in Peace, but it's as a near perfect record as it gets in my eyes, just like with Peace Sells But Who's Buying. And when it comes to some of the later Megadeth albums that I do like, I find Euthanasia to be one of these other Megadeth albums where the favoritism is actually very high. Mastodon's Once More Around the Sun is, to me, a really, really good record. And again, I won't be talking about the album in this part as much because I'm thinking about re-reviewing the record. I did review it when it came out, but as an album, Once More Around the Sun to me was a very interesting product of music. It can be pretty sludgy still, but there are elements into a bit of proggy stuff to hard rock stuff, and it's arguably like the most varied driven album in the band's discography. Metallica, Load and Reload, some of the most catchiest and memorable sources of tracks, especially through the passionate vocals from Hetfield and the loose, the bluesy, and very adventurous take. With Reload, I still don't care for that record very, very much. It's, to me, one of those records that does not deliver in the same way, and the whole value of following Load to something as similar, Reload's trying its best, it does not fulfill a lot of the same attachment that I always have with Load. And I still find some of Reload's tracks to feature some of the worst songs the band has created, besides like with Invisible Kid from the Saint Anger record. But yeah, Reload, I don't think it's a Metallica record that I would personally listen to as much. Iron Maiden's The X Factor. I have already talked about this album way too many times to this point. It's a very different record, but Iron Maiden is not all about Bruce Dickinson. Many Maiden fans already know that. The quality into The X Factor features some of the best, most personal and charging records with the difficulty Harris was going through around this point in his life and career. The album is still very divided. I do defend my own words and wisdom that this is still my favourite Iron Maiden record. Not the best, but the favoritism of this album is what I think suits me better. Jomsviking by Amon Amarth. I think this is a pretty okay record. Besides the ferocious style that the band have continued to do through their loud, epic and anthemic signature sound for a really long time, this album is not one of the best and not one of the strongest. However, it has so much of the great energy and still the terrific vocal performances and the production. But in terms of the songwriting, it doesn't follow as the greater form like with the classic that is Twilight of the Thunder God and With Odin on Our Side. And to me, I think some of the earlier Amon Amarth albums have the attachments that I actually like to prefer in those selections than this one. but this one is a pretty good record. Nostradamus by Judas Priest. I actually think that this could be a bit of a challenge to listen to this, because it is a concept album, obviously, with beautiful artwork, by the way, but since that this is known as a very bloated record, just like with the awful Dream Theater album, The Astonishing, I will hope that there will be some sentiment and value to get into this record. I actually haven't listened to this record all the way through yet. Surprised that Nostradamus is one of your favorite underrated albums from one of the greatest hard rock to, at some points, heavy metal bands of all time. Be Mindful and Wise, Deftones self-titled, Lamb of God Wrath, Alice in Chains self-titled, In Flames Reroute to Remain, and System of a Down steal this album. I absolutely agree that the self-titled Deftones album is underrated. I've actually played this album a couple of days ago because it has got to be, in my opinion, an album that I have been growing to love, but Saturday Night Wrist to be a much higher and bigger favourite than this one. But the album did not shy away the growing expectations of the material of this record to connect, because originally I thought it was like an above average record. There was the moment when I really wanted to try again and again and again, and when I got it, I really love most of this record. I think Moana is, to me, not one of the best closing tracks from the band, but I love tracks like with Minerva, to Anniversary of an Uninteresting Event, to Battle Axe, Bloody Cape, Hexagram. This album is the heaviest record the band has created in its extreme moodiness and the bleak darkness that it has. One of the most underappreciated gems. When it comes to Wrath by Lamb of God, I remember buying the album when it first came out, and it's highly acceptable that some fans see this as underrated, but I see Wrath as maybe one of the strongest albums Lamb of God has created in a really long time, and with the other albums like the next one after this of Resolution, some fans don't care about it. I really enjoyed that album, but with Wrath, it's still as firesome through the chaotic drumming, groovy riffs, and Blythe's vocals were still stunning to hear. And not gonna lie, this is one of the other catchiest moments in the band's music, like some of the blastful moments like on the single Set to Fail. So this is an awesome Lamb of God record. The self-titled Alice in Chains record is the heaviest in terms on the heavy subject matter, and the production is really in your face. I really got to love a lot of the Alice in Chains stuff. Yes, I find Alice in Chains to be one of my favourite bands, but I've actually been playing these guys' music a lot, and now owning all of Alice in Chains' albums on CD. The self-titled, an acquired taste for some, but you can't go wrong with some tracks like Heaven Beside You and Grind to Sludge Factory and Frogs. Over Now. Super underrated. Dirt is maybe the magnum opus for the band's discography entirely, not just with the Lane Staley period. Besides that, I am a big fan of Black Gives Way to Blue as well. The self-titled is an amazingly doomy and heavily textured record into the most brutal topics in lyrics, and the crushing tones from Jerry's guitar work. It's a very, very strong record. In Flames Reroute to Remain, this is to me the last great thing that In Flames had created, and they have shied away from what they used to do and move forward progressively into the more alternative sounds into the later albums. A really good album. The drum sound can be a little iffy and questionable for me personally. However, when it comes to the songs, I think they are really catchy in moments, like with Cloud Connected and Trigger. I remember the music video moments on these two songs very well. It's a really good, strong enough In Flames album. And I was still amazed that Foregone, their newest album, has won me over after all these years of being away from the band's discography. System of a Down's Steal This Album. The whole discography of System of a Down is, to me, one of my most favourites in the modern metal period, when the band was growing through the changes in the scenes of new metal to then later alternative metal. Steal This Album, it's nostalgia through the roof. When I was a huge fan of this band, and I still am, Steal This Album, you can't beat tracks like with Chicken Stew, Inner Vision, Fuck the System, and Boom, and Ego Brain, and Roulette, to the other songs. And it's near perfection. It's actually my second favourite System of a Down record. Zach D Productions, Iron Maiden's The X Factor, Demon Hunter Extremist, Korn Take a Look in the Mirror, Overkill I Hear Black, and In Flames, once again with Sounds of a Playground Fading. Take a Look in the Mirror by Korn. Korn is one album that was troublesome for me. I liked it originally quite a bit, but over time, when I was listening to the later part of their discography, and yet I will review the rest of this band's discography, but I'll keep it short and sweet. Take a Look in the Mirror, unfortunately, is not a really good Korn album because the production suffered, as I think the drums sounded really boxy and weak. The songwriting was forced and generic. I don't find Take a Look in the Mirror to follow up Untouchables in a successful way, because Untouchables was grimy, in your face, and pretty destructive, with one of the best produced records in their catalogue of albums. Most of the band hated the album, but it's not their worst. Sounds of a Playground Fading by In Flames. I have never really paid attention to the later grounds of In Flames music in this direction, because they just went into some of their most unimaginative and forgettable moments and forgettable laziness of the band's writing. But good for you, Zach, for citing this as one of your favourite underrated albums. I guess it had some okay points, but not the worst In Flames record, not as worse as Siren Charms, that is for sure. A trying yet troubling record from what it sounds, in my personal opinion. The last one is from Metal Band Chronicles, Slayer Divine Intervention, Dio Strange Highways, and Black Sabbath Born Again. Black Sabbath's Born Again, there are many Sabbath fans that cite it as one of the classics in their discography, but I wholeheartedly disagree. It's a really raw but disgustingly rough around the edges. The production is trash and the album cover is also atrocious, but the music on some songs, and despite some of the lyrics from Ian Gillan, wow. Tracks like with the title track to Digital Bitch, and even with Disturbing the Priest, these are really, really good songs with some of Gillan's best vocals yet. It's only the weaknesses that had suffered drastically. Good for you as well for loving this album, and it's understandable that the album had been later on cited as one of the classics. But for me, as a fanatic of Black Sabbath, there were other Sabbath albums that are even more underrated and overlooked that I would prefer to listen to more, hence most of the Tony Martin period of Black Sabbath. Strange Highways by Dio is not all that much of one of the epics in his catalogue, but it still drives through some terrific performances through obviously the vocal department from Dio, and some of the riffs too, the tracks themselves are very solid and still pretty engaging stuff, but you can't beat the classic album that is Holy Diver, and some other really good records like The Last in Line, but also Dream Evil is another one that is one of my favourites. But Strange Highway is one highly enjoyable, to at some points a neat grower of a record. There you go, guys. That is my long response video to all of your comments. I know this was a lengthy ramble, but I'll do my best to answer all of these types of questions for a newer music question video like this one. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.